Welcome back to Questing Beast, everyone. I'm Ben, and today I am joined by two of my favorite D&D YouTubers from Down Under, and that is Dael Kingsmill and the Bard from Bardic Broadcasts. Thank you both for being here today.
Hooray!
Dael, why don't you go first? Do you want to just introduce yourself, and what is the deal with your channel?
Hi, I'm Dael Kingsmill. Lovely to meet you all. I make a YouTube channel called Monarch's Factory. I've been uploading videos there for a very long time now. I think I'm creeping up on the 8-year mark. And a lot of the videos that I make there are about D&D from the perspective of like sort of home brewing, but also with a particular angle for people who are newer to the game, and sort of learning as you go and just trying things and seeing how you can evoke narrative concepts and emotional reactions from players through tinkering with the rules.
Fantastic. And Bard, what's your channel all about?
Hail, I'm the Bard, and I run a fine channel, if I say so myself, called BardicBroadcasts, which is barely D&D related. In fact, I'm not sure that I have ever done a D&D video. I'm here because our host spotted some D&D books on my shelf, so he made a deduction. Now, normally, I do cracking unboxings of games, books, that sort of thing, and I also review occasionally statues and figures of the collectible variety, that sort of thing. So if that's your kind of bag, you might enjoy my channel, but I refuse to make any guarantees.
Both of their channels are awesome. I will put links down in the description below. Go and click on those things and then click the subscribe button on their channels, because I did that years ago and I've never regretted it. It's been fantastic. So we're about to jump into some viewer questions here and from patrons. Before we do, though, quick shout out to our sponsor for this video, which is Into the AM. Into the AM creates a wide variety of t-shirts, often with fantasy, sci-fi, or psychedelic themes. The one that I'm wearing right now is of the world tree with the world serpent gnawing at its roots. It would work really well if you're running any sort of Norse or Viking flavored game. All the shirts that they've sent me have been very high quality and very comfortable, and I strongly recommend them. I'll put a link down in the description below where you can check out their web store for yourself, and by clicking the link, you will get 10% off their entire web store. They also have a whole bunch of new t-shirts that they've recently released, so head down to that link and check it out for yourself. And we're back. So let's talk about our opening discussion question that I came up with, and I did steal this from the Bard, and that is why D&D is so great. Because I feel like that's a topic that, weirdly enough, doesn't get talked about all that much. If you go on a lot of forums, you find a lot of people who are talking about alternatives to D&D, and they're perhaps rightfully a little bit miffed that D&D is the big elephant in the room, and most people play it, and it's hard to kind of break out of it. But not a lot of people really discuss why it is that D&D is the big elephant in the room. It was the first one, but that's probably not the only thing that has made it such a juggernaut. The Bard, do you want to take this away?
Of course. D&D, it's no mystery that if it's not strictly the best quality or the most fun, depending on your own personal tastes, it would be very hard to argue that it's not the most important of all of the role-playing games. It's the defining one. It's the cornerstone of the genre. And I think that a great deal of that actually can be owed to its strength in that it's welded so strongly to the heroic fantasy and high fantasy genre, which during its inception was enormously popular and probably remains so to this day. And I think that it becoming so popular in that sense led to it becoming indelible. It's what people think of when they think of role-playing games. It's the one. It's the silhouette of the genre, if you will.
Yeah, it's really in danger of becoming like the Kleenex or like the Hoover of role-playing games, because people use it as almost synonymous with the whole hobby, which I'm sure Wizard of the Coast is not terribly thrilled about. The other thing that occurred to me was that D&D is deceptively simple to play versus a lot of other games, right? So people make fun of Armor Class, for example, but Armor Class is mostly there as a simplifying strategy because you don't have to do subtraction to figure out damage if you had damage reduction. Especially if you go back to early editions of D&D, it's really easy to pick up. The very earliest editions, you could make a character in 5 minutes on an index card. And so you could have random strangers walk by and just say, like, what are you doing? And you could make them a character and they could start playing right away. And even like the focus on dungeons in particular as like these confined problem solving spaces, that don't take a whole lot of time to make, but that are a lot of fun to run, I think created this structure that was really addicting for people. And it's kind of stuck ever since.
Yeah, and I think it's also significant that from an external point of view, for people outside of the hobby, that idea of it becoming synonymous with the hobby, I think that's because you've got in the broader cultural consciousness, this is the game, but partly because it was the first game, and partly because of things like the Satanic Panic. You've got this as the understanding of what it is. People don't know what a tabletop role play game is, but if you say Dungeons and Dragons, people kind of have an idea. And so it has become this, if you're looking for pop cultural touchstones of tabletop roleplay games, it's Dungeons and Dragons. It's in Freaks and Geeks they played Dungeons and Dragons, in Community they played Dungeons and Dragons. It's the game that pulls its way through. And I understand people's frustration with D&D being seen as like the only game, but I see a lot of people talk about it as though oh, it's because Wizards of the Coast are the ones putting it out there as if it's the only game there is. And I don't think that's what it is. I don't think that's what's causing it. I think it's that all the way through, this language has developed that is sourced from D&D. If we didn't have D&D at the beginning, we wouldn't have the language to construct roleplay games as they currently are. We wouldn't have the language to talk about it. It all kind of originates there. And as you come through, even to today, even 5e, it's the most popular because it's so simple. It's so easy to get people into it. And on top of that, you have live games like Critical Role that you can show people. You can just get them to watch it and they'll understand how it plays. That's the easiest way to understand how something plays, is to be able to watch it happen and then replicate it yourself. So it's really that it has this kind of almost inbuilt mechanical welcoming factor that's like, hey, you can join in, and that got picked up by pop culture and that got spread around. So it does have this kind of magical community element to it that's really just made it the hottest game on the market.
Yeah, and people talk about how like Dungeons and Dragons is like a 300-page book, and that's too much for a beginner's RPG. But the actual rules are really, really simple. It's mostly just roll a d20 and try and roll high, and new players can do that from the get-go. And beginning level characters, level 1s, are really simple to run, at least if you're doing a fighter or something like that.
The spells take up most of the book.
Yeah.
For 300, it's mostly spells. The actual rules are very, very brief, or mostly brief. It depends what book you're reading, I guess. But with reference to D&D being like the touchstone and the idea that it's being marketed that way, I don't know that it's the marketing very much, so much as it is, or at least in part, a lot of these, I want an alternative to D&D. All of the other games are always defined in reference to D&D. They're defined by being separate from D&D. So you can't escape the touch of D&D no matter what you do. It's very difficult.
I've been reading a really great book on that topic called The Elusive Shift by, what's his name again? John Peterson, who did Playing at the World. And so the whole book just studies D&D has just come out, and then the whole hobby gaming industry, or everyone who plays hobby games, looks at it and can't figure out what they're looking at. And over the next couple of years, everyone goes crazy trying to figure out what this game is and like what it did right and what it did wrong. It's a really interesting book because it goes into just those early years when no one knew what they were dealing with or even what to call it. So let's go on to our next question, which is from LFOSR. He asks, which module is most nostalgic for you?
That's an almighty question.
Yeah, I don't know if this even if I would even qualify for this. I only started playing D&D with any seriousness like 7 or 8 years ago. So I don't have a lot of nostalgia for the really old modules, but I don't know if that's the case for either of you.
I'm in sort of a similar position. I only started playing, I mean, it's a more complicated situation, but I want to say about 5 years ago was when I started properly playing. And I, started in Pathfinder and all sorts of things. And I'm also, I'm a filthy homebrewer. So mostly I put my own stuff in front of my players, but I do have a lot of nostalgia for, I ran a Pathfinder module that's called, it has a name, I'm thinking of it right now. It's something, there's a hawk in the title and there's a disease. This is really helpful. This is helpful stuff. But no, I have a lot of sort of nostalgia for these old Pathfinder ones like Curse of the Crimson Throne that I played in as a player, and this one that I ran that was like there's a disease in a town and you have to go and find the ingredients to make the cure, that I ran for my family. So a lot of the early stuff that I did where I actually was running modules while kind of generating my own content.
Well, I don't feel I'm qualified to answer this question particularly well because I've never really used modules. And when I first started, my old Grandmaster DM from back in the day, he never used modules either. But I do have kind of an answer, and that is the original Ravenloft module. Not because I ever ran it, but because I looted it extensively during my own Ravenloft campaign. And I was running a third edition Ravenloft campaign, and I found it inadequate. So I always was raiding the second edition and like all the earlier stuff for information. And I loved the castle map, and I loved all the detail of the town and the village, which was the center point of my campaign, and the terrain around it. And the old original module is one of the only Ravenloft products, I hate the word product, but product that manages to capture or even come close to capturing a bit of that Gothic atmosphere. Now, I should qualify that. I haven't read every Ravenloft thing that there has ever been, but that was a wonderful, wonderful module for looting purposes for me. And I'm sure it would be fine if you ran it too, but I don't really like modules at all for extended reasons that are too long to go into here.
That's interesting because the last people that I talked to on this show both said the same thing, that Ravenloft was one of their favorite episode or favorite modules for like similar reasons. I've never played it, but I have seen that map, the isometric map of the castle. And that's beautiful. It's so good because you can see everything. It has the 3 dimensions, which you need to have for a 3-dimensional castle for it to make any sense. That's really great.
I also just looked it up because I felt terrible just being like, it's a one with a thing that happens in it. It's called Hollow's Last Hope, so it doesn't have Hawk in the name at all.
It's not called Hawk's disease.
No.
Very disappointed.
Maybe in my head it was Hollow's Last Hawk.
I've never played any Pathfinder modules, really. I started off playing Pathfinder 2. I played that for like a year or so before we moved into 5th edition D&D. But yeah, I never really played any modules for that either. It was pretty much all homebrew. I've run like some short dungeons. I have like a big collection of short dungeons back there, but I typically don't run like campaign modules just because I can't stick with it for that long in terms of just like keeping players on like the path that this book has created for them.
Yeah, and also just as a DM, I get the itch. I want to change it. I'm reading and I'm like, but what if this happened instead? And I automatically just start going off book.
Yeah.
I don't even understand how campaign modules are supposed to work. Like, I own some. Like, I've bought the books and I've read parts of them, and I think, are they supposed to? Am I supposed to stick to this line through the whole thing? And I don't see how it could work. I don't know how players could stand it. What if you sat down to D&D and the DM had these campaign books? It's like the whole thing's written. What am I here for?
Sometimes I feel like that. I've seen players play like that, where they just, they're waiting for the next plot point. Like, all right, we finished plot point number 2. Where's plot point number 3? And then it's kind of delivered to them, and then they make the appropriate rolls, and now they're on to plot point 4. And it's a very different kind of game than the thing that I've been exposed to.
It'd be so easy for me to just come out and rail against it. But the truth is, people obviously play that way. And I have to just admit, I don't understand it. I've never been in such a campaign. I don't have, like, I look at the books and I can't imagine how it would go down. That's
very
that's
impressive.
where
I once talked to, I was having a conversation with James Hake, who, works at Wizards of the Coast, and he just finished doing some of the writing on Descent into Avernus. And I ended up having this conversation with him where I was just saying, I don't know how you do it. I don't know how you write in negative space, because you can't, like, the characters are the leads, and you don't know what they're going to do. So how can you construct a story around them without knowing what they're going to do? And he said that it's like a really particular muscle that he just had to exercise for a really long time, trying to work out how you could publish stuff that leaves out the most core important moments of like choice.
Yeah. I've seen people attempt it mostly by not creating a campaign module, but creating a setting that has enough interesting just situations going on that players are pretty free to just move around between them. And then you could kind of riff off what's happening. But anything that has a built-in story, is just kind of inscrutable to me. I wouldn't want to play in it.
It's fascinating. It's fascinating stuff.
Yeah. I should get someone on who plays a lot of those and just ask them what they're doing.
Please explain. I need to understand.
Okay, our next question is from, let's see. Oh, John P., who says, how do you typically handle retainers during a dungeon crawl? If you handle retainers at all. I don't know, Dael, do you typically do that sort of thing?
Not tons of it, but my players have the option. When I do run it, I don't know. I feel like I use the very sort of simple, straightforward method of just I run them socially and the players run them physically, if that makes sense. You know, if there's a combat, the player is deciding all the things that they're doing. But if they're asking them questions, I'm the one answering, which, you know, frees me up plenty. I don't have to. The stuff that really takes up brain space for me is always the maths, because I'm not great at quick maths. It's like a lot of little bits of addition, not my wheelhouse. So I'm a theater and English major. It's not for me. So if they're taking up all of the sort of mechanical, mathematical dice rolling portions of the character, then I feel like I have enough brain space freed up to handle just running them socially. So I don't know whether that's like a helpful answer, but that's how I handle it.
Sure, yeah.
Dael, you're very much like me in that I have a lot of trouble numerically as well. Like when we roll, say, 3d6, I'll be the last person at the table who will understand what's actually been rolled.
You're just sitting there going, okay, I'm adding, I swear, there's a 3 and a 5, and I know that adds up to something.
Yeah, you're staring at it. I can see it. Like it's coming, and everyone else is already there, you know. Disaster. I just trust them. They can handle the dice. I'll do all the other stuff. But retainers, see, I'm a second edition man of old, I should say. And retainers, and that makes me think of henchmen, which is a little bit of a snare, okay? Because retainers and henchmen are two different things. In second edition, you've got hirelings, you've got followers, and you've got henchmen. And in older editions, at least recently, I believe I opened up the old rules cyclopedia of basic D&D, or whatever you would like to call it. And it's got retainers. And the key difference between retainers and henchmen is that retainers are professional adventurers like yourself that you hire, and henchmen are friends that you make. This is a fundamental difference. In fact, in second edition, there are no rules for getting henchmen. It says when it feels right, when the players have made a friend, that can be their henchman, and they take over running nebulous, that character.
I love it.
Yeah, all of the responsibility of running that character goes onto the player, and they're completely responsible for what they do. However, the dungeon master can keep secrets. Like you normally don't reveal their alignment, and you don't reveal their magical items if they're keeping them secret or anything like that. Things like that can be hidden, but what the player needs to know, well, their combat prowess and what have you, will be revealed to them, and they'll have a pretty good idea of their basic personality. And the guideline in second edition is that at any time, whenever the player declares that the henchman is doing something, the DM can overrule it as being out of character without further explanation, basically. And when the question mentions a dungeon crawl, and I'm not sure how that would change things. They come with you. Retainers and henchmen, I believe, will both come with you. Things like followers and hirelings will never come to a dungeon with you. For the simple reason is you're the professional adventurer. That's your job. Hirelings are like blacksmiths and various professionals. Followers are like your army. If you're a fighter that reaches 9th level, you gain followers, for example. They just appear and they sit in your castle, and they're your army. They'll join you because you're such a reputable warrior. They'll join your retinue, but they won't go adventuring down in some dungeon with you because that's not their purview. You're the adventurer. That's your job. Your hireling will come with you, and he's a friend. And if they're treated well, or I should say, not hireling, your henchman, and as long as they're treated well and their needs are met, they'll be with you. And there's also another rule: they should always be lower level than the player character, because if they're ever equal level or higher, then what are they doing hanging around you? They'll go off on their own adventures. They'll still be your friend, but they'll break off and have their own henchmen and all of that sort of thing. I'm really not sure why a dungeon crawl would change any of what I've just sort of outlined.
Yeah, probably not. I mean, I think that's just typically the environment that basic D&D takes place in particular. Most of the stuff that I review on my channel has to do with basic D&D. That's usually what I play. So I think that's probably part of it, because it's so structured around the dungeon. versus something like AD&D?
It occurs to me we might be talking about death. We might be talking about using your henchmen to trigger traps and things like that, or suggesting that they
Oh my
go
God,
ahead.
that's grim. That's
It's
so
grim.
grim.
The second edition rules actually address this as well. And you can actually develop a reputation for mistreating your henchmen, and you will get no more. If you lose one, no more will come. You actually have a lifetime limit. Under the charisma attribute in second edition, there is a number of henchmen column. And the higher your charisma is, obviously, the higher the number will be. But it's not how many you can have at once; it's how many you will have over your lifetime. And if you think about it, it's
so
reasonably accurate, because how many really good and high quality, valuable friends do you make over your life? If your charisma is 10, I think it's 4 or 5. That's about accurate, to an ordinary person's life. It's good. So there's a limit. You don't want to waste them. So you be careful, treat them well, and they'll look after you in turn.
That's fascinating. I had no idea that it was like a lifetime supply. So that would really incentivize you to not throw their lives away. They'd be really special. I didn't know that you were into AD&D. That's really interesting too, because almost no one I know plays AD&D. Like everyone I know plays 5th edition or like basic. That's like the only things.
Second edition in particular is my bag, let's say. For many years I railed against it. All right, a lot of people probably have a similar story, where when third edition came out, I wasn't really on board with third edition immediately. It took a couple of years, but I played it and I thought, I would say to my friends, what about that second edition D&D with its list of pole arms, and every weapon's got different proficiencies. If you're proficient in the spear, you're not proficient in the billhook. You've got to get a different. And what a stupid game that was. But one day I realized I was playing third edition D&D, and I looked at it and I realized I hate this. This isn't any good. And many years later, I picked up my second edition books again. And it's better qualities, and it's not a perfect game. It has many problems. Oh boy. But its better qualities really shone through, and it's not something that a lot of people even talk about. And I've been meaning for a long time to talk about it on my channel. I just can't find the tone, I guess. I don't know how to do it, but I'll get to it someday. Someday I'll get to this sort of thing.
It'll happen.
Oh, yes.
I'm really looking forward to that, because I want to hear your thoughts on it. No one talks about AD&D, so that would be really interesting. Let's see. Randolph SC asks, in your experience, what is the best or easiest method to play sandbox style? Any specific products or methods that you might employ to create situations and areas on the fly or right before a session? Off the top of my head, you probably need a lot of resources that you've planned ahead of time. Random tables are really good. My own game, Maze Rats, has a whole ton of random tables that are designed for this, where it has most of the different things that you would need, that you can randomly generate them when you need them. Collecting things like small dungeons, I think, is great, because you can just kind of scatter them around your environment. People can go to them. You just pull out that little module, and then you can run the dungeon and put it away. Or books like A Tome of Adventure Design, which have a lot of stuff like that. You guys know of any other resources or ideas?
I suspect that my advice is not going to be the most useful in the world. But I kind of look at sandboxing, and I feel like it is best played by either the type of DM who is super duper into world building. That's really where you get all your fun. You spend lots of your free time doing it, even if it's stuff that your players are nowhere near. You really just pour a lot into it. And so you kind of know what is where before people start playing. So when they decide, we're going to head north, you can narrow down and you know what is already north. You know the thing. So you can sort of easily zoom into what you've already known about your setting, and you can prep the stuff that you know that you'll need. Or on the other end of the scale, for people who don't mind the lie of it, I suppose, having a version of sandboxing that really it just feels like a sandbox, but isn't actually necessarily one, the kind of game where you'll just start them out in a town, and then when they decide to go somewhere, they'll end up in whatever your second place is, no matter what direction they go. That kind of a thing where it's unfolding in front of them, and from a player perspective might feel like a sandbox, but from your perspective as the DM is kind of more like a series of flashcards of information that you'll just put where they need to be, which either method can backfire in myriad ways, but I think sandboxing in the sense of really just letting your players go and do whatever the hell they want to do. I think it most easily meshes with those two methods of DMing. So I don't know. I don't know if that's helpful at all, but it is the thought that came from my brain.
As a DM who I believe has probably made just about every mistake you can make, I'm going to recommend strongly not to do Dael's second suggestion. So I don't, but seriously, when you do that, you are cheating your players, and they will know. This is important. If they don't know right away, they'll know one day. But even if they never know, you're faking it. You're cheating them. Okay, the illusion of choice doesn't have any value. But look, that aside, I think it's a terrible, like a metagaming habit that once you start doing that, I think it can become a serious crutch, and you'll just stall. If you want to develop useful skills as a DM, I think you're going to stall critically if you rely on, well, if they go left, they wind up in the bathhouse. If they go right, they wind up in the bathhouse. Either way, I can do a really good bathhouse and I'll look like a genius, right? Because they had free choice. You're like a magician, right? You're fooling them. And I don't think that's strictly valuable to you in the long term, and I don't think it's valuable to your players, and I don't think it makes for a good
burn
campaign.
on magicians as well. Wow.
Yes. Traitors to the art. But look,
I think that there can be some value in it. I think it depends on what you value as a DM and what your players value in their game. Do they value the narrative of it more than the gaminess of it? You know what I mean? Like I think modern D&D in particular has really taken an angle that is partly probably because of Critical Role being the most popular touchstone. People want to play a story, and the game isn't necessarily built for running a story, but if that's what your players are looking for, I think you can get a lot out of that method, but still having the feel of the sandbox is what brings it back to it being D&D rather than just being hanging out with your friends and riffing a story. But that's I do fair. Think that what you're saying is also fair, so please do continue.
Yeah, that's fair. I suppose it reveals more about what my values are than anything. It does depend on your values and what you're after. Oh, that's absolutely true. But as far as sandboxes go, I get the impression that sandbox has a really clear definition in role-playing games that maybe I haven't really considered. Because to me, sandbox, it looks like it's come to imply largeness, like vastness of scope, big areas, world building, big, lots of dungeons. You'll need lots of dungeons. And I don't think sandbox need imply that, because a sandbox in itself is a limited space. Okay. And to me, I think the word sandbox actually implies an absence of linearity and an absence of limitations. And if I was to say I was playing sandbox style, what I would be meaning is that I don't have preconceived solutions that the players must find. I would be ready to accept whatever they come up with, and I'd be ready to roll with their wild ideas or their wild solutions and let them play out fully, which I think is actually really good practice, and it's more fun for the players, because even just once, I swear, if a player has been playing with a different style, like you've got to find the solution, and you've been listening to the DM say, "Oh, it doesn't work," in response to your every suggestion for 3 hours, and I think if they sat down at a session and their wild idea was actually tested instead of shut down, then, and especially if it's successful, oh man, and most of the time they will be, if you actually try it, these wild plans can actually pan out if you give them a chance. But to me, that's what sandbox is. It's not having preset linearity and not being ready with the walls all the time. Oh no, you can't go there. You couldn't possibly try that. No, I didn't plan for that. So no, the statue doesn't fall over when you push it. Why not? I wasn't ready. There's a iron rod running through the statue that sinks into the ground for 10 meters. That's why.
No, I like that idea of conceiving of a sandbox as just an area that you have actual freedom to explore. Like, I've often thought about dungeons, especially things like mega dungeons, as kind of a sandbox in microcosm, where it still has limits because obviously there's walls and so on. But a good mega dungeon, or even just a medium-sized dungeon, is not linear. It has like an inter-branching network of tunnels and rooms that can be explored in any order, and players are sort of have that freedom of action within there. And then maybe like an overworld sandbox is like that, but just scaled up a little bit.
It's so true. And when you think about it, this idea of the changing definition of the word sandbox, like if you think about the difference between approaching the concept of a sandbox in an RPG, a tabletop RPG, versus in a video game, if you hear the word sandbox in connection with a video game, you expect that it's just going to be like, oh well, here's the city and you can go wherever you want in the city. Like you can do these quests in different orders, you can all that sort of a stuff. So that idea of it not being linear really comes into play there. And I suppose I don't have the clearest definition of what the majority of people expect from a sandbox in a tabletop RPG, because it's not exactly the majority of the stuff I've run or the majority of stuff I've played in. But no, it is certainly, it's interesting to consider.
Video games. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, one piece of advice that occurred to me that I'd heard before is a way to make this easier, if you really want to have a lot of freedom of player movement in your world, is just to plan out just what the next session is going to be. But then at the end of the session, just ask the players, what are you going to do next? Next session, where are you going to go? Like, are you going to pursue this faction? You're going to go to that city? And they just tell you. And then the next session, you just prepare that. So they do have real freedom of action. They're making real choices. But you're not just like doing it all on the fly.
The answer is just always communication, isn't it? Like it always comes back to just talk to your players, please.
I've done that. That's a good move. The problem is 50% of the time at least, they'll come back and say, actually, second thought.
We've changed our minds.
We were talking about it over the week and we're actually going to go to Tunna.
It goes both ways. Players, please also talk to your DM. Please, if you change your mind, let us know.
Get in a Discord group. Let us know your plans. That's a classic format for running sandbox campaigns, the West Marches, where the idea is that all the players are like in a Discord or some sort of forum together, and they just discuss what they want to do next, and they create their own parties, and then they just tell the DM prepares it, and then they just run it. So that can work well. But yeah, you need to have a lot of communication. Let's see. Our next question is from Miguel Pombo, who asks, what resources, tricks, or narrative tools do you find most useful for GMing a horror game? Bard, have you run any horror games?
I ran a Ravenloft campaign for over a year. And I've got to say, I have no clue about horror games. I'm serious. Like Ravenloft is like, it promotes itself, or it's marketed or it's understood as a gothic horror campaign setting. Okay. And when my campaign was over, I said, I'm never doing this again, because I think D&D and gothic horror, at least gothic horror, that genre, they don't go together. A D&D campaign has no room for the excesses required of your gothic protagonist, your gothic hero, your gothic heroine. There's no room. So the players get displaced as the main character because you have to have some extravagant gothic character to serve as the actual protagonist of the story, and the players get reduced to basically the engine that moves the story along. I didn't like it. But there's other games that do horror, and I have very little experience with those. Like, for example, I've read several Vampire the Masquerade books. I've got no idea how that game is supposed to be played. Like, I read them, and I've listened to people talk about their campaigns of Vampire, and it just sounds like D&D to me. And it's because I'm really only have experience, and I'm only really interested in heroic fantasy adventure. Now, there's horror in it, but to have a whole campaign made of horror, I don't know. Like with Ravenloft, I would only return to Ravenloft sporadically, like it was originally conceived. It was like a place that you drift into, and it's so different from everywhere else. It's because it's based on gothic horror, which isn't really a sustaining genre. It doesn't lend itself to epic length stories, multiple novels and that
I
sort
actually, this is very interesting. I just released a video where I was talking about the importance of considering genre in your D&D game, because I sort of set it up as basically D&D, like even just in the name of it, Dungeons and Dragons, right? It has this inherent connection to specifically high fantasy as a genre. And you have to be able to match the generic expectations that your players will have going into that. And so if you want to shift genre, you have to make sure that it's going to fit. So you can't just, plonk your players in a gothic horror setting, but have it be D&D and have it work. You really have to stop and you have to consider the generic expectations that come with high fantasy, that your players are like, oh, I'm playing D&D, that's it. And the gothic horror expectations that come with that genre, and you have to try to make them merge. I sort of use the example of actually your example of saying, the gothic horror hero or heroine is this sort of extravagant solo figure, and you don't get that in D&D, because it's one of the inherent things of D&D is that you're likely to have a medium to large sized party of fantasy heroes, and they just don't slot into gothic horror. So you have to kind of try to figure out the places where you can subvert expectations of genre without damaging the player's place within the narrative and pulling them out of the game mentally. So when it comes to running horror, it really depends on, I think my advice is just what genre of horror. So you've already got the expectations that come with horror, but they are all going to have very different things. If you're running a ghost story, that's going to be extremely different to a zombie story. So looking at texts from within that genre and figuring out what your players will be expecting and where you can use that to your advantage, let it do the heavy lifting, carry them through like a slipstream. They'll understand. They have the genre savvy to understand what the story is going to be and to kind of follow along with that, because there is fun in following that story. But then you can also find other places where you change the expectations and give a little bit of a thrill of, oh, it's actually got some points of difference to what we expect. But it really is, examining texts from within that genre and working out what are the points of expectation. You
could probably do
game,
it.
Sorry, in a horror game, I was just gonna say that one of the main tropes is a feeling of helplessness, where there's things that you simply can't fight or you can't kill, and you have to run or hide from them. And that, I think, kind of does fight against D&D a little bit, because so much of it is people want to fight things. But if it's a real horror game, you should be able to fight it. Yeah. So that can be an issue. I think in some earlier versions of D&D, it works a little bit better. Like if you're like a level 1 or 2 character in basic D&D and you're doing a dungeon crawl, it's kind of like a survival horror game anyway, because your characters die in 1 or 2 hits. You're crawling through like these black corridors where things are like crawling up on you. And you're just trying to get out alive. So there's that feeling of helplessness and the feeling of just trying to survive, and the feeling of death being a real possibility around every corner. But those are very different tropes than what you typically see in modern D&D.
I probably wouldn't try it with D&D. Like D&D is so strongly tilted towards heroic fantasy that if you want to change the genre, it would be very, very difficult, because the game itself works against you, because you've got all of these high fantasy, heroic fantasy tropes. And if you want to suddenly make it horror, it's difficult. I guess it depends. Like you say, D&D is pretty horrific most of the time. It's full of unkillable things, and it's not really a combat engine, even though the combat rules take up so much space. And the reason they take up so much space is because combat is the most perilous thing that you will do with any regularity, which is a good argument as to why it should never be your first resort. But actual horror, like, I wonder if it is about death, or if I wonder if it is about invulnerable enemies as much as it should be trying to evoke an atmosphere. And you'd have to be consistent across the whole campaign, unless, because if you just did it just suddenly, it'd be very much mood whiplash. And why is my hero suddenly expected to be afraid of the shadows, Whereas so I guess Ravenloft is built in. It's got the mist comes up, and there's a whole different oppression atmosphere that sort of is built into that setting. I guess you could make an argument for it there, but it's a lot tougher.
I think honestly, the bare bones rules of D&D, they do have some ties to high fantasy that you just can't avoid, but they themselves don't carry such a deep connection to the fantasy genre. It's more the words that we wrap around the rules that do that. So if you start out setting your expectations, if you in a session 0 say, this is going to be it's going to have those fantasy elements that are necessary for D&D, but it's also going to focus on this type of horror. Then your players are going to do a lot of the work shifting their expectations for it. And then that means that you as the DM can then just do the bit of work that needs to be done for the rest of it mechanically to make it fit the horror genre.
You're right.
But there will be things that definitely you do actually have to keep in mind as you're running it. Things like if you're trying to establish a mood of suspense. I'm trying to remember who it was. It might have been I don't want to say Todorov. There's a philosopher somewhere who sort of says that suspense is caused by or fear in horror is caused by the suspending between knowing that something is happening and not knowing why or how it's happening. So, it's that moment of you see the photo of that terrifying creature in the middle of the road at night, and you don't understand how it could possibly be real. And it's before you realize that it's a cow and it's just the white patches showing up. That's the moment that it breaks and it's no longer horror. But before that, when you know something is happening, but you don't know what it is yet, that creates horror. So that's like one practical thing that you can do to take these rules that on the face of them shouldn't fit horror too well. You can sort of twist it and just not give explanations for some things. Let the monster drip feed into the story for a long time before the players can actually fight it. I did a video a while back that was talking about ghosts, how to do a ghost story in the middle of your D&D campaign, which I suppose it's a one-off special for Halloween or whatever. But when you do that, it's just play with those tropes of what a ghost is and don't let people have the answers straight away. You don't know what has caused the ghost, where the ghost is, what the ghost looks like, who the ghost is, any of those things. All you have are the things that the ghost is doing, and sort of playing, really, really digging in and swapping out the tropes that you're using in your game.
Yeah, there's a really sort of interesting comparison between genres here, because we've got high fantasy, which D&D definitely, gestures toward, and then we've got sword and sorcery, which is dripping with horror. Yeah, if you had a sword and sorcery role-playing game, of which there are several, horror is so natural to that, because sword and sorcery is about being human and being vulnerable. The barbarian hero is a hero because he succeeds despite his human vulnerabilities, and he faces the monster, or as they often do, he runs away after dealing it a deadly blow and saving the captured priestess, and he runs away. Like, success, right? He measures success in his own survival. His heart is beating. He's seen the face of death and survived. Wonderful horror stuff, and it uplifts you. That's the benefit of terror. But it's so hard in high fantasy and D&D when you're dealing with characters who can see in the dark, because controlling their perceptions. Okay, atmosphere 101, perception of the characters, being able to
bane of my existence.
Huge problem. Yeah. That didn't exist before the year 2000. All of a sudden, elves don't have to sleep. They can see in the dark. They're immune to hypnotism or whatever. Well, I don't know if they're immune.
First thing I change. None of you can see in the dark. Elves have to sleep.
Yes.
It makes such a huge difference in dungeons when you have to you pack torches. And then you have to light the torch, and then guess what? You can see 20 feet in front of you, and now after like an hour, you're deep into the dungeon, and your last torch goes out. Yeah.
God.
And now you're just stuck in the darkness, and you're like blindly crawling around as things are eating you.
I have a lot of feelings about this.
I played with that a little bit in Ravenloft. See, I had this monster that lived in a crypt. It was a thing in a coffin. It was called the Evil Sleep. And whenever characters would get anywhere near it, they would fall asleep. That's just nothing you can do about it. Elves don't sleep. So only an elf.
They're immune to sleep magic.
They are immune to sleep magic. So the only character who could begin to deal with this thing, could find the vulnerability that it has, would be an elf. So if there was an elf in the party, you could do that. Or you'd have to find some way of resisting sleep, of which there's several, There was a tiny little child-sized coffin with something in it. It was good. It was a good monster. It was a good challenge.
I just remembered a principle from a game that was actually designed for horror, which is Mothership, which does sci-fi horror in particular. And it has a little like aphorism where it says, when you're running a horror game, there's three things: save, survive, and solve. But you can only do two of them if you've set it up correctly. Ooh. So you survive and you save people, but you never solve it. So you never know what was going on. Or you survive and you solve things, but you couldn't save the people. Or you can solve it and save people, but then you die. So you have to like pick two of those things. That's what a good structure is like. When
That's
you can't
interesting. I like that.
Yeah, you have to leave something behind. So there's always like regret, whether you died or you didn't solve it or you left someone behind.
That's so essential to the resolution of horror, because horror needs resolution, even if that resolution is more questions, which is another reason the Gothic characters don't fit in D&D parties, is because they have to resolve and then they fade. They have to end. The story must end, and D&D characters so often go on to more adventures. But you don't want to go on to more horror. Nobody would do that. It's psychologically weird. Anyway.
All right, let's go to our next question. Nicholas Beer asks, how do you make travel interesting and evoke a sense of exploration? And I know Dael has talked about this before. Yeah.
This is another one that I just recently did a video on. Yeah, I revisited. So one of my earliest D&D videos was about travel and exploration and how I handled it. And then as my videos got more popular, more and more people were watching back that one. I'm like, it's not actually very good. I don't think I agree with my past self anymore. So I did another video recently and basically came to the conclusion that I think travel and exploration are different things, and that you need to decide at the beginning whether your goal is travel, you are getting from point A to point B, or whether your goal is exploration, which is often a very different kind of game. In a typical D&D campaign, you'll do a lot of travel. Even if you are doing it in the form of the example I used was the movie Willow. You're traveling because you need to take the baby to the Daikini Crossroads, and then once you're at the Daikini Crossroads, then you end up traveling to where the fairy queen is in the forest with the brownies, and then the fairy queen tells you have to find Finn Rizal, so you go to find Finn. That's all very point A, point B, point A, point B. Over and over again, and there's obstacles in the way trying to stop you. But you basically map it out like you would a D&D session. It just happens to be on the road while moving. It would be structured in a very similar way to any dungeon, narratively at least. But when you're talking about exploration, it's a very different style of game. It means that's often like a core thing that your players are looking for, that you are running. It's very West Marches. It's like, go out and find what's in the wilderness. And the difference between the two of them is that travel, you can really just rely on, here's an encounter that comes in the way, here's some description of the scenery that you're going past. Whereas when you're dealing with exploration, it's about enticing them a little bit further. It's like we just brought up the torches and how you can run out. You really want to tempt them. You've only got 4 days worth of rations. You're 2 days out, but you see there's something just half a day, a full day further out that you could get to. And would you be able to get there and still make it back? It's that risk reward that really comes into it. You want to entice them. You want to draw them along with that lack of they don't know what's out there, but they know that there is something out there.
Very good. I'd add a third state. There's traveling and exploring here. I would also add being lost to the three to consider. I don't really have an expansion upon that, but I'd also just put it in the mind for later when you're thinking about this. If this inspires thought, think about travel and exploration and being lost. But I agree with Dael greatly. But I do have one move that I like to do that I think enhances both travel and exploring wide areas of countryside, and that is let them see things. See, nothing foreshadows themselves like mountains do, because you see them from a long way away. So if they're going to be going out into a terrain, say a region, the West Marches, whatever, I would also always suggest rigging it so that very early they're on a very high point so that they can see lots of things. See, you don't travel unless you've got a destination. So they're probably going somewhere. So they probably have somewhere in mind. But on the way, let them see the distant mountains and the deep woods and the smoke of like charcoal burners in a distant valley or something like that. Let them see, get an idea. Look, this is really worth your while to get an idea of what things look like at distance, or how far away people can see, and how the terrain affects vision. Because if you can evoke that just a little bit, it will be suggestive of this huge expanse. Even if you haven't prepared anything for over there, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. If you can just put all these locations in the imagination of the players that they're going past, even if they go into a deep wood with no visibility, they've seen all these distant things, and in their mind, they're going past them. It makes the terrain of your campaign so rich. It's good. I recommend.
I love that. Absolutely love that. And the other thing that it does is that, the films of Lord of the Rings have kind of spoiled us for travel in tabletop RPGs, because now people expect this, these sweeping vistas and whatever. And you can do that in a movie. It's very difficult to do that in a game. But what you're describing replicates that feeling of these beautiful things that you see just in these travel montages in film that I think in a lot of ways otherwise would be inaccessible. Feels like the wrong word, maybe too strong a word for a tabletop RPG, but harder to get to.
Yeah. They'll remember too. They'll remember these things. Like, I wonder where the dragon is, and the dwarf will say, what about that distant volcano from 8 years ago when we passed through the valley? There's a mighty volcano, bloody dragon in there. They'll remember and they'll say, why don't we try that village that we saw from the hilltop? It's good. Try it out.
That's really a trick that video games use a lot, right? Any sort of open world game, like the Assassin's Creed games or the Zelda games, it's like climb the high thing and then look around. And they do that over and over to give you a sense of the landscape.
Yeah.
Yeah. So getting lost is a big thing too. I'm doing the rather stupid project of reading the entire AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide out loud, which I'm doing part by part on my channel. It's going to take me a couple of years, probably.
Good luck.
It doesn't look that long because here it is. It's over here. It doesn't look that long, but every page is equivalent to about 4 pages of normal text.
In terms of written by Gygax.
Tiny little letters.
It's written by Gygax in what is sometimes called Grand High Gygaxian. It's great.
And it goes on and
on.
It's
not good for your voice or your eyes.
No, I'm learning stuff. Every once in a while, like you'll read like a little nugget that'll pop out. You're like, whoa, that's really cool. And then he'll spend, 6 pages describing the modifiers for hirelings. So like, I love the idea of having hirelings, and then you have like morale rolls and checking for loyalty. He has like 4 pages of text this small just going on about modifiers for it. Stuff that no one ever used, including Gygax. And he's like, people have said that later, he never used any AD&D rules when he was actually running his own games, basically. But yeah, he has a lot of rules for getting lost in there, which were actually pretty good, especially if it's a hex crawl. You can roll a d6 and you can veer off in different directions and things like that. So, but that matters especially if you're doing a lot of mapping. So if you have a guy who's actually trying to figure out where you are on the hex map, then you can put mechanics like that in more easily. Let's see. Next question is from, so it's about high level play. So he says, I'm gearing to write a digital OSR module compatible with high level 5e this summer. And he says, I wonder what are the non-negotiable, sorry, actually that's a different one. I've lost it, but he does want to know about, there was one that wanted to know about high level play. Is there a way to manage that? Especially when you have characters have tons of hit points, they can do ridiculous amounts of damage. How do you keep the game interesting?
Oh, I think it's this one by Rob Parr. I think I've got it here.
Oh, there it is. I think I found it again. Yeah.
Yeah. You want to read it out?
Yeah. So he just says, OSR elements are one of the only ways I've managed to keep a 6-year-long 5e campaign of level 19 characters interesting and threatening. But I'm all ears if you have any suggestions or personal experience with a successful high-level play. It just never feels like the game was designed for it, regardless of edition. But often ends up my favorite level range to DM for the gonzo, huge damage and high stakes.
I agree. I agree with regard that the game wasn't designed for high-level play. It does seem to break down. Now, I've never been at high-level play. I've never achieved it. I've never had a party that got up there. I have very little advice for you because it's not like an MMO where the rest of the game is a preamble to being the optimum level and then the game opens up. It's not like that. The game is with you from level 1 and you're playing the real thing the whole time. So I really have no advice regarding high level.
I'm similarly unuseful. I've never run for a high level game. I've never played in a high level game. And part of that, I mean, I'm, based in 5e and I'm, doing my homebrew stuff. But you read the core books and you can tell that they don't even plan for you to really reach beyond level 17 at the most, because the class abilities that you get start getting not cool for some reason. I've never understood why you look at the book and your 20th level ability, unless you're like a paladin, theirs is pretty cool. But like most classes, the 20th level ability is really lackluster. And you can just, and they're publishing modules that finish at level, 15 or whatever, because they just don't expect anyone to reach that level of play. They don't expect campaigns to last that long. But I think there is a flaw in that thinking, because a lot of people want to play short campaigns starting high level or things like that. So not building in a lot of stuff to make the game function at that point is, I think, a bit of a fatal flaw. Certainly when I start tinkering with my own game design stuff from scratch, I every single time have found myself going, and you stop at level 10, because there's no point in, if I don't think that the game is going to gain value, even if it's just plateauing at value once you hit level 12 or whatever, there's no real point in letting it continue beyond then. It's if you're not feeling like there's more to be had, more to be developed, then what's really the point in it, which isn't helpful to you.
It's especially the way that like D&D works, where every level gives you more hit points. Things start getting really wonky, where it's like, you're a level 20 character, like going by the rules, at least the ones that I could found in the 5th edition rules, your character can just like strip naked and just dive into a pool of lava. And just like, they'll take like 10d6 damage, but they'll be fine. They'll just like take a nap afterwards, and it's like, this doesn't make any sense
scale
anymore.
In the same way, so then battles end up getting really long for no, like we've had a game that almost the whole way through battles are like 5-ish rounds, and then you get to high level play and suddenly it's like, okay, I guess we're just gonna keep going just because everyone's got all the hit points in the world.
Yeah,
man. High level play in editions from 3rd edition upwards, let's say, very different to old high level play. And I think it's the abilities. You get so many, you just get weighed down with all of these abilities, or all of these things that you can do that you need mechanical permission for. I'm sort of getting in. Sorry, look, I come from, I'm starting to have my disdain for modern D&D.
We didn't have any advice, so we both were just like, let me complain instead.
Well, look, high level play in 2nd edition, which I'm more familiar with, is completely different in character. I believe it would be. Anyway, I'm speculating here, and I'm sorry to everyone who has actually experienced high-level play in 2nd and in modern, or either or, because I'm just speculating. I think it would be much easier simply because you don't have a lot of the baggage. For example, at a certain point, you stop gaining hit dice in 2nd edition. At 9th, I think, for most classes, you'll stop gaining hit dice. You'll instead have 9 plus 3. You'll get a certain amount per level. It'll be 2 or 3, I think, sometimes. And you don't have all of these abilities that you have to remember. You just get better at what you've always been doing. Mages would maybe be an exception. They always accrue more spells, but you always have a limited set of spells, and over time you'll just become so familiar with them. And that is the exceptional class in that regard. Also, high-level play is not achievable by many, many characters in 2nd edition because non-human characters can't get there. This is the way 2nd edition and old D&D was balanced. See, the advantage of humans have no inherent advantage. They don't get plus to anything. They have the worst deal out of all of the races that you can choose, okay? The elves have all their advantages. The dwarves have all of their advantages. Humans have nothing. What humans have is the ability to choose any class and to raise to any level in any class, which no other race even approaches. The highest, I think, is like elven mages, I think, can get to 15. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head. So some people out there will be able to. I don't remember the specific numbers. But, another advantage that the non-human races have is that they can multi-class, and humans can't do that. They can do something called dual classing, which is a whole other thing, which we shouldn't get into. But yeah, so high level, quote unquote, high level play is inaccessible. And the truth is that high level play in second edition is honestly about level 10 and up for everybody. All that happens after that is the numbers get bigger.
Yeah.
Really. So
I think in a lot of the really early editions, what would happen is you would get to level 10 or so, and your character would basically leave the game. They would graduate from being an adventurer to being a landowner, whether they owned a temple if they were a cleric or a castle if they were a fighter. And they would become like semi-NPCs where they were just like, they would graduate. They would have a lord, they would have armies, and then you would go back to creating adventurers again. And then your PC would just be like an NPC that just existed in the background. Because at that point, by the time you're level 10 or higher, doing a lot of adventuring doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
That's the tone of the game changes.
Yeah.
Look, this doesn't happen in modern D&D, but get ready. Okay. Say you're a fighter, you get to level 9. It's written into the rules that this happens. You are recognized by the local authority as a great warrior. You are made a lord. You are given a castle and lands. You become a lord. You have all of the responsibility. That's when your followers show up. That's when you get the 100 horsemen and the 200 spearmen, and everyone just shows up because you're a great lord. Now the tone of the game is completely different. This happens for everybody, okay? But fighters are the great example. Your adventuring life changes. All of a sudden there's a problem. Why? Lord Handelberg will handle this. My lord, the king will come and he'll say, you've performed well in the past. Will you do this? Maybe that's the sort of thing that doesn't happen to you beforehand, but we've become a lord. All of a sudden, you're the man. You're the go-to. You're the people under you, the peasants who you have a duty to protect, will ask you for help. Like if there is, say, a dungeon, the traditional thing, a dungeon full of terrible monsters, okay? You might hear about it from like the head man of a village on the edge of your territory. He says, oh, this thing has appeared. Will you handle this? And all of your men, your knights, all of your horsemen, they won't do it. You have to do it. You're the great warrior. It's wonderful stuff. And you rally your old adventuring companions. You're like in semi-retirement. The experience changes. The tone of the game changes. Wonderful stuff. And you earn it too, because you've gone from level 1 to level 9 and 10 plus. It's great stuff. It's great.
Very cool. That's very cool. I suppose we should say something advicey. The OSR thing that's working for you, that's great. Keep up doing more of that. Start homebrewing stuff. Don't use monsters from the monster manual. They won't work. You can start using Strongholds and Followers by Matt Colville. Starts getting into that stuff, and probably Kingdoms of Warfare when it comes out will be more what we're talking about here. But if you want that vibe that Bard is talking about, you can transform the game so that it includes this sort of warfare element, this kingdom political intrigue element that is more of a global player. Start applying that. I know that the first Let's Play series that they did on MCDM ended with, they had sort of a big battle going on outside the castle that the players were running at the same time as they were doing a standard D&D battle. So while that stuff was filled with all the flaws that it'll be filled with, because that's what high level play is like, you're going to have this other stuff to kind of buff it and make it feel more exciting in the background.
Yeah. And going back to the whole, like, why D&D is so great. Someone told me once that D&D isn't really a game, it's games. It's a series of different games that are all like just kind of hooked together as you need them. And that's like one of the best things about it, because you can go from being an adventurer to running essentially a war game, and it's still D&D. It's fine. It's just a different kind of game. You're engaging with your setting just at a new level. I really love that about it. One other thing I would give as a piece of advice, I don't really run high level games either, but there is a D&D like game called Godbound that's designed specifically for this, where you basically play, level 20-ish characters, you're demigods. And you're explicitly demigods. You have godlike powers. And so the whole game is designed around how do you make that entertaining and fun? And a lot of it is giving players the types of challenges that doing massive damage won't fix. So you have a problem with like the kingdom, and there's like corrupt politicians, and everything is just mired in corruption. You can't just walk in and drop a fireball and the situation's fixed. Or you could, but now there's a power vacuum and now you have to deal with all sorts of other chaos in the realm. So you have to use your powers, but you have to think about things other than just how much damage can I take or deal.
The scope of the story changes.
Yeah. You have to think about that when you're that powerful. I think we're almost out of time. Let's do one more question. There's a bunch of different options here.
Hit points.
Hit points.
Oh, sorry.
Was there a question on hit points? Let's see.
There was.
There was? Which one?
We can do that and another one if you want.
Go for it.
Or whatever. This one by No Fun Allowed, I found very intriguing.
Go for it.
Look, he says, do you prefer systems where you can live when you drop to 0 hit points or dying outright when you hit that number? I think it's a good question. What do you think?
It is very interesting because the first thing that I thought of when I read that question as well was the first time I was ever running the game for a group of friends. I can remember very distinctly my friend Michaela, it was the Pathfinder beginner box, which I think is a great beginner box because it's very just like one session, hit you with everything the game can be, boom, you're in. But at some point, my friend Michaela was downed by like, I don't know, a giant lobster or something. And she hit 0 hit points and she sort of said, oh, well, I'm dead, so I'm done. And I sort of lit up. I was like, actually, no, you're not dead. And in Pathfinder, it's that you start tracking negative hit points, and it's only once you hit or original Pathfinder, because I haven't played Pathfinder 2. Don't tell on me. But it was, track negative hit points until you hit your hit point total, and then you're dead. And I sort of explained that to her. I said, you're not dead, actually. And she seemed almost more upset that she had to continue like tracking character stuff. She's like, so now I don't get to play, but I still have to do maths. Like it was the total upset of like, she was sad that she was dead. She was mad she was dead, but she was more mad that she wasn't dead. So, I like the abstraction. I like the concept of the abstraction of hit points, and not health points, but hit points. But I do think that it kind of doesn't work, and probably a lot of players don't like it. I understand from a game design perspective how we've gotten here and why it's a decent system for what we're trying to do. But I feel like out there must be something better.
Now, I have gone through some player deaths, and I have an opinion on this. I really hate, that's a strong word, but I'll use it in this case, wishy-washy death rules. I don't like, you're down, you're on 0, but you're negative if you take one more hit, or, every round you lose a hit point. I like 0 being death. And the reason, like the wishy-washy death rules, I think they suck all of the power out of the moment of death, all of the meaning. One thing I like to say to players when we start a new campaign is, I'd tell them straight up, understand that your character is probably going to die. And this campaign, any campaign you play, is really about finding out what their fate is and how they meet it. It's not, there's no expectation of great success, but if you make it, then wonderful. And if they retire, then that's great, and you should aim for that. But death is a serious possibility. There are two things that I love about 0 hit points being death, is that it makes 2 things possible that I think are very useful, and I don't know if people do them. The first is beautiful, clean death blows, the sudden instant of death. Okay, and the finality of it, the suddenness of it, it's jarring sometimes, but there's something even better. There's something even better that I like, and that's mortally wounded. This is something that negative hit points make impossible, okay? Because they delay death, and I don't like that, and they delay it mechanically. Something I love to do, and it's not always the right time to do it. I don't have rules for when to do it. It's just something you sense, because you know the people that you play with, presumably, and the situation will warrant it, or it'll feel right, and that's when you do it. A character is dead, they're dead, okay? They're dead, but they're mortally wounded, and that means when the battle's done, they still have a moment left. And it's being mortally wounded is so romantic, right? You're on 0 hit points. Your character is dead. But you as a player, the other players, and more importantly, the other characters, they get to say goodbye. It's magic, right? It's so good. You can't do that when I'm approaching -10. Final speech, no, 0 dead. And of course, the beautiful, clean death blow, that doesn't happen, but that has a majesty all of its own, a beautiful, beautiful finality and an end of a story. But the mortally wounded, dying with dignity, both of these things have dignity, and I think that the slow wishy-washy, am I dead sort of liminal state that the characters slip into under a lot of modern rules really robs them of a lot of the dignity of passing on, which I think is so valuable, because it's the final point when that player goes on to tell the story of that character or the story of their adventures. There's no better thing than a really elegant and dignified and clear end. Good stuff. I like, that's my method. Those two things, I like them.
The thing that strikes me about hit points that I really like, with 0 being death, is just the way that it affects the way the players think about combat and danger. Because when you have, well, going to 0 doesn't actually kill you, or well, let's see, there's a couple calculations they have to make. How much damage am I going to take on the next attack? Will that bring me to 0? Will it bring me to less than 0? If it's less than 0, then, you know, how many death saving throws can I make if it's 5th edition? Or how many more hits do I have to take before I'm actually dead? And then there's all of these calculations that sort of muddle the tactics in terms of thinking, if I'm 2 hit points away from 0, then I'm 2 hit points away from death. So if monsters do a certain amount of damage, then I have a certain chance of dying. And it just makes things a lot clearer. It brings the level of danger that you're in into like sharper focus, instead of everything just getting kind of blurred out by all of these layers of things you have to go through.
You see what I mean? Yeah. How it mechanizes, it replaces, because losing a character is very emotional.
Yeah.
If you've played them, mechanizing death and delaying it, and it just makes it so much worse. I think knowing that my character is dead or about to die, that they're mortally wounded, and I get a moment to reflect and just sort of think, what are their final words going to be? You get to think about that. You know, you get a moment. The other characters will probably all gather around you. Beautiful stuff. Wonderful. It's worth so much more than whatever any mechanic could possibly add, even if you live. You know, even if the mechanic allows for a chance of survival, there's others in games where 0 is death. There's other mechanics that save you. Saving throws, hit points themselves are a death prevention mechanic. It's wonderful. Anyway, I'm rambling on.
I absolutely agree. And you're right. There is a magic to it that is lost in the abstraction. I understand why we've ended up with this abstraction of death. But when you look at like any different system with an abstraction of injury and death and health and, you know, whatever, you know, whether it's wounds, whether it's, you know, these things, every single one of them to me ends up feeling fake. You know, you feel the fakeness of it. Particularly when it's a fantasy game, you're in the thick of combat, something as blunt, and it's bizarre. Before this question, I never really considered the idea of just at 0, you are dead. Because, you know, there is this bluntness to it that matches its form and content work together to create meaning, right? It's like this old literary thing of like, whatever you're doing mechanically to create it, technically to create it, has to match the emotion that you're going for. Whereas like, I had this conversation with Thinking DM on Twitter at some point where we were talking about trying to get that, you know, that death speech, that magic Boromir, like final, let me say goodbye, and how you can do that. But when we were talking about it, it sort of came to the realization that death saving throws as they exist in 5e, you know, they're great if you survive. I understand how people love them if you survive, because then it's edge of your seat. You know, you're rolling your saving throw and, oh, you didn't make the first one, but the second one you do, and you come back from the brink of death, and it's very exciting to be able to like beat death in that way. But that's only if you survive. If you die, it's a very boring and kind of traumatic experience, because you roll your death save and you fail it. You roll your second death save and you fail it. Your third death save doesn't feel like, at that point, it doesn't feel like edge of your seat. It feels like, man, I can't believe I have to sit here every time and roll the dice every time when I'm clearly already dead. You know, it doesn't feel fun if you die and then you're just dead. And it's, you know, it's this kind of miserable little experience instead of having that magic. But, you know, one of the other things that could really be gained from 0 is death. Even just speaking mechanically, is the idea that 5e in particular has this yo-yo that people talk about, where healing spells and healing potions don't do enough to really bother using them during combat, particularly because rules is written it takes an action to take one, so it's just not worth the trade-off. So people wait till someone is down. They wait till they're at 0 hit points, then they heal them, and they bounce right back up instead of dying. And so it's just this, you're down, you're back, you're down, you're back, which death at 0 means that doesn't work. You have to put the effort in to keep your hit points up during. That's like an immediate fix to that problem that has always been described. Because otherwise people are just like, oh, well, I see a lot of people implement the thing where if you go down, you come back with a level of exhaustion. That just feels like it's going to lead to a death spiral for the whole party. It's not
It's
fun.
more things to track. Yeah.
You know, I honestly, I think if your player group are willing to try it, trying death at 0 is definitely worthwhile, because you'll get that bluntness, that callousness of death in combat that comes with its own tragic magic that Bard was talking about.
Yeah, the like what you're saying is giving me PTSD flashbacks to games that I've played in the past where this happened to almost the whole party. There was like 5 of us. We were fighting something that was way out of our league. I think my character eventually was just like, I'm out, and just ran because it was clearly we couldn't win the fight. But the rest of the people kept fighting, and like 3 of them went down, but then they would bounce back up again. And then they would all go down and bounce back up. And the combat went on for like an hour of just 4 or 5 people just like bouncing up and down. It was awful. Or I've played in other games where my character has gone to -0. Maybe it was in Pathfinder. And he was just unconscious for like an hour of real game time. And it was just like, oh, we wait for your character to be healed before you're back in the game. And I would just be like, okay. And I would just wait for like an hour before something would happen as everyone else kept playing. And it's the worst.
What becomes obvious when you read 2nd edition is that, and I suppose AD&D as well, is that healing magic wasn't really meant to be used as a combat move. That seems apparent to me, because I don't want to really get into how to play a cleric and all that stuff. There's a lot of mythology around clerics, all right, that plays into it. People feel obligated to have the healing spells prepared, which is why we got the 3rd edition move. What is it? Transfer. What is it? Spontaneous casting. It was
I've never played 3rd edition.
3rd edition had this thing. I don't know if later editions had it. I don't know if 4th had it. I don't know. I've only played 5th a little bit, where you could memorize any spells and then you could at will change any of those spells into a healing spell.
Oh, they kind of have something similar to that. Depending on the domain you pick now, you have some spells that always count as prepared, so you can swap them out for the spells that you actually prepared. Yeah,
that's
so they're not necessarily healing anymore, but yeah.
Yeah, I find that's a whole other topic, but I find the idea that clerics in the past, in earlier editions, were compelled to have healing spells on hand to be largely myth. But I guess it doesn't come from nowhere, but I don't think it was a legitimate thing. That's a discussion for another time.
From what I understand, the really early clerics weren't healing characters. They were based on Van Helsing more than anything else.
Not all clerics could heal.
Yeah. They were about fighting undead specifically, because undead were a particular extreme threat in early versions of the game.
Yeah, unless they were evil.
You still have the legacy of that too. In whatever it's called now. I haven't played a cleric. I'm trying to remember what they're all called. But in the divine thing, whatever. I shouldn't have brought this up when I don't. No, I'm just talking about clerics in 5e. They've got just a bunch of inbuilt fight the undead stuff. Even though they've moved on to a totally different thing for clerics with 5e, they're like, you could be anything. You could be a trickery cleric, right? But you still are you have this legacy of, but you're here to kill skeletons.
Yeah,
I tell you.
Because in early versions, undead things had no morale rolls, so they would never flee, and they were totally silent, so you could never hear them. So whenever you ran into, and some of the undead stuff, when they touch you, they would drain a level.
Oh, yes.
So undead were terrifying, and you never wanted to get near them. So that's why you had clerics, because clerics were there just like turning undead constantly to keep these things away from you.
That is horrifying.
Dael,
yeah.
You seem surprised at this.
I am surprised. That's scary as hell.
Yeah.
Level drain is a terror weapon.
Ooh, no.
People are more scared of losing levels than they are of their character dying. Like,
yeah.
Oh my gosh.
It's really interesting.
That's awful. That's deadly.
Listen, it's a big sign. It's a big signpost that says, "Do not fight this monster in single combat." Okay, you know what could do it? Vampires could do it. Now, vampires, if they touched you, they'd drain a level, and they do it every time they touched you. So, but what is it with vampires? They've got all these vulnerabilities. Okay, they're the poster child for the undead. They're the original holders of the word undead. You know, how do you get rid of a vampire? You find its lair in the daytime and you stake it and you cut its head off. You don't sword fight it, you know. And every undead creature that does that is all something that you should not sword fight. Do not sword fight wraiths. Do not sword fight vampires and
ghouls.
wights,
I think
and ghouls can paralyze you.
Yeah.
Wraiths drain your strength. At least in 3rd edition they did. Oh, my first Ravenloft session, the players were hunted through the woods by these wraiths, and one of them got touched at one point, and they lost 4 strength permanently from just being touched by this wraith. It was terrifying. Like, I tried to do the horror thing. But listen, clerics. I want to talk about clerics briefly. Will you indulge me?
Go for it.
Okay,
Yes.
because clerics of old aren't like clerics of today. Okay, paladins of today are even less like paladins of old. That's a whole other thing. Clerics, though, are interesting. Did you know that clerics weren't obligated to actually worship a specific god in the old days? You could be a cleric of good. You could worship an ideal instead. You know, it's interesting stuff. Clerics could turn undead. And you're right that clerics always had that sort of anti-undead focus, and evil clerics had a pro-undead focus. So they were the ones raising undead, and their turn undead was bolster undead and all that. But what a lot of people don't know is that evil clerics have a fascinating ability. In addition to bolster undead, which I think is a 3rd edition thing, in 2nd edition they could turn paladins. They can turn good. It was just like the turn undead spell, except it would affect paladins, because paladins were the shining examples of virtue back then. They weren't just fighters who had a particular conviction in those days. They were the exemplars of great virtue, the champions of good. They were the shining ones, and evil clerics could turn them. It's incredible stuff. Marvelous. And not all clerics could heal, because when you picked a cleric in 2nd edition,
flavorful.
Yeah, if you chose a god or a different ideal, it's usually a god, to be specific. They are supposed to be priests after all. Your god dictated what you had access to, and you had access to things called spheres of what that god was influenced in. There were major spheres and minor spheres, and you had, I forget the exact numbers. You had access to the major spheres that this god has, but access to the minor spheres was only up to 3rd level. And the spheres dictated what your magic was, and not all gods, and really not that many gods, had healing in those spheres. So a lot of clerics, or maybe not a lot of clerics, because most people fell for the trickery and felt obligated to do healing, at least when I started playing. I don't think that's necessarily was a real obligation. That's a whole other theory that I'm going to work on. But you could be a cleric of things besides healing, and gods had different objectives in healing, and religion wasn't just the healing station, you know, in old D&D. And I think the Warhammer world, I don't know if either of you are familiar with that, treated, when it still existed canonically, treated its gods with an amazing degree of, I guess, respect in that regard. Because there was a god of healing, but there was really only one, and there was a god of, well, not a god of death. There was a god of the dead and dreams and the dead, and they weren't obligated to heal. They were obligated to look after the dead and really nothing else. And Sigmar, the god of the empire, had like one healing spell, but he wasn't a god of healing. He was a god of war. Specifically a god of the chain of command and obeying your superiors, a military god, unlike Ulrich, who was a god of chaotic battle and all that sort of stuff. So the priests in Warhammer were so clearly marked out, you know, that, and when I played that, and that's, Wolfrup is actually my favorite role-playing. Wolfrup is Warhammer Fantasy roleplay. I don't remember exactly why or when I picked up the term Wolfrup, but that's what I call it. When I started playing that, I noticed that players who wanted to be priests or become priests, because it doesn't have a class system, it's got a whole other thing, they felt no obligation to be the Healy ones. There was no sense at all that the party needed a healer, even though the game was quite a dangerous game. It dealt a lot with what wouldn't get you in that game was death. What would get you was injury and disease. That's what would get you. It wasn't running out of
the famous death
points.
and dismemberment table.
Yeah, it's got a few famous tables. So that's what would get you.
Let's just go into one more question, which is one that I wanted to ask both of you. Go for it.
Wait. No, I just had a thought while we were talking about Warhammer that is just one last thing on the hit points. I'm very sorry. But you know what I think has made it so that we can't rely on abstraction of health in tabletop RPGs is video games. We're so used to it now that in video games, you've got your health bar, and once you hit the bottom of the health bar, you're dead. And so abstraction clashes with this idea, because even though in video games it's a health bar and in tabletop RPGs it's hit points, which is very nebulous and different, we still think of it the same as a health bar.
Yeah, video games.
That's my point that I'm making.
I think video games have really damaged how people see hit points over time. Because when you play even a D&D video game, when you say Baldur's Gate, you run your character up to a monster and you attack and he misses, what does it do? It goes, whoosh, it makes a miss noise, meaning he just missed. So that damages your idea about what armor class is, what hit points do. And when you hit a monster, every time you hit, blood comes out. It was a penetrating blow, you know. So you get high level warriors who get slashed and stabbed that many times. Hit points don't reflect physical resilience. Sorry, that's like a side point.
It is interesting how how video games have come back around to maybe negatively affect role-playing games when virtually
positively, I'm sure, you know,
I don't think so.
But so many
of influence.
So many of like video games
negative only.
Negative only. Well, that was part of the next question that I was going to ask, which is just what who said this? Marshall Waters, favorite games outside of tabletop role-playing games. And then I'm just going to add on to that. In what ways do those things positively affect or affect in any way the type of role-playing games you run?
Do you want to take it back?
Well, favorite games outside of Hero Quest, obviously.
Well, I know you're into Warhammer too.
Warhammer is good, but you know what? I barely played the war game. I was more interested in the world, you see.
Yeah.
And the few times I did play the war game, I didn't like it that much. You know, I didn't think, it's not really my thing. And I like miniatures. I like painting miniatures. Yeah. I argue endlessly that they should be as far away from D&D as possible, but I like them. But I'm not a great tabletop war game player. I really played the role-playing game. Gee whiz, great question. What on earth do I play? See, I don't like card games much either. I went through a small period of playing Magic the Gathering. I didn't last that long. I eventually saw through it. It's like, I don't like the way it works. You know, with its the way it enforces its own perpetuity. Other than that, I like computer games, especially older computer games, because, you know, that's just the kind of person I am. So recently I've been playing a lot of old Amiga games. I stream it sometimes, occasionally. I don't have a regular schedule or anything.
Older, what kind of games?
Amiga, games on the old Commodore Amiga and other old ones. Specifically sword and sorcery ones that I've missed out on.
Interesting.
And also related is that I have a long history when I was very young of playing choose your own adventure games. I love those. They were but they're role play. You know, they basically dovetail into it. This is a very difficult question.
I was going to say, in terms of choose your own adventure games, probably the games that influenced me the most as a kid were the like old LucasArts point and click adventure games, stuff like like Monkey Island or Grim Fandango, or the like Riven, like the Myst games. Myst and Riven were hugely influential on me in terms of thinking about world building and solving problems through like lateral thinking. A lot of those games had that, where you had to like, you know, combine the glue with the scissors and then apply it to the vine over here. So a lot of the adventures that I write now, I think were probably influenced most by those games, where combat is a thing, but it's mostly about understanding the environment and using it in weird ways. I think that was the biggest influence.
My favorite games outside of tabletop RPGs, I love video games. I'm a big old gamer. I would say my favorites there, I probably like Assassin's Creed 2, Portal 2. I love Dragon Age Inquisition. I love, just so, and the first Halo game, Combat Evolved, just like I love video games. Big fan of video games. I love board games as well. I would say my favorite of those is probably Dead of Winter without any of the expansions. It's this zombie game that really focuses on the fact that survival is not just don't get killed by zombies, but is so many other things. And I love it's got this mechanic in it that's a deck of cards called the Crossroads cards. And it's basically just any time you are taking your turn, the person to your right draws a card from this big deck, and there's like a secret trigger on it. And they just have to watch you throughout your turn. And it'll be something really specific. It'll be like, I don't know, if the player travels outside of the colony, or if the player uses a vehicle, things like that. And then they go, aha, you've triggered my trap card. And they read it out, and it's just something really thematic, a little narrative thing. And you have to make a moral choice. And, sometimes they'll both be good options and you have to pick the best of two, or sometimes they'll both be bad options and there's no good option for you to choose from. Or, maybe you'll get a bunch of good stuff, but you'll have to lose something else, or you can choose to not do anything. It's like these really interesting things where it'll be like, there's a snowstorm, this is what's happening. This person's grandma has been bitten by a zombie, and you have to decide, they just give you a moral choice and you have to decide what to do. And originally the plan for those games, which I wish we'd seen come to fruition, it sadly hasn't, was that they were going to do different genres of game. And the first one that everyone voted for in the original Kickstarter was zombies. They wanted a zombie game. And so they made Dead of Winter. And then they were planning like a sci-fi game, and they were planning like different ones along the line. I think they've made one other one, but mostly they've just turned to the success of the first game and made expansions. But I really would have loved to see that sort of Crossroads mechanic be applied to all sorts of different genres. But no, I think I let video games influence my game in tons of ways, particularly because I'm such a home brewer. A lot of the time, if I'm trying to come up with a mechanic for something that I think is flimsy or weak in the rules as written for D&D, I'll turn to video games along a similar theme and see the mechanics that they use and try to make analog versions of them. Because I've always found it so interesting that tabletop RPGs had such a huge influence on video games in general. You've got your RPG video games, but like every video game has taken some level of influence from tabletop RPGs.
The whole shooter genre is all based on D&D.
The entire, yeah, exactly. And so then we have reached this point where I think video games are now, standing on their own. We can start pulling stuff back from them and seeing how we can apply it to D&D and to other games that we play. I made a video about that recently too. Hey, I sound really productive in this. I sound like I've just been really on top of my game.
I can't believe I didn't even think of board games.
Aha, what's your favorite board game?
Well, Hero Quest is a board game.
Hero Quest is it is. I never think of it as a board game. Of course, I said Hero Quest already, but I didn't even think of board games outside of Hero Quest. But I wanted to say that Lord of the Rings game from a long time ago. I don't even know who published it now.
Was it the co-op one?
Oh, yes.
The Reiner Knizia? Yeah.
Yeah, that's the man.
Yeah.
He was the designer. That was a really good one. That's one I remember very fondly. But Mordheim. Of course, how could I forget Noble Mordheim, the miniature skirmish game? I love that. That's a tremendous game. But we were talking about hit points earlier. I wanted to say, and there was a joke in there about how first-person shooters based on D&D. Well, I can tell you that I believe the hit point to be the longest-running and most prominent rule ever conceived, because it is in every game where there's any kind of violence basically features hit points, including a genre that is, I'm going to deliberately go as far from tabletop games as I can, except for hit points. And I'll say that I enjoy fighting games. From the early days of Street Fighter until now. And I'm still not particularly good. In fact, I'm quite terrible at most of them. I don't play them enough, but I do like them. And they hold a certain fascination for me, even though I don't play them as much as I would like. Very interesting stuff. And I often wonder if that's where like the best video game combat mechanics might be located. Maybe not yet, because they're all awfully weird and mechanical focused and weirdly meta in their own ways with their glitches that become canonized as mechanics that get carried on into the future, well, that sort of thing. But I wonder if there shouldn't be something that we could indeed summon, as Dael has suggested, from a genre, even one like fighting games, that we could somehow use. I don't know, maybe.
I would love to see people sort of replicate the way in Injustice, Gods Among Us, you know, you've got this really deep system with the environment where you can use it to your advantage in the fight. I would love to see people mechanize that for tabletop RPGs, for example.
Oh, I wouldn't. I like that to be improv. See, because my basic stance
here's where I stand. I agree with you. I would love for it to be improv, but I think the thing is, I play with a lot of new players, and because they're coming at it from a background of a world that includes video games, they expect to have rules in order to do things, and it's really hard to break them of that. So if there is a mechanic that just encourages it, I love that, because it just means that then they start using their imagination. So I agree with you that ideally, in my ideal world, they would just do it because that's how the game works. You can imagine it, you can do it. But since they don't do that, I would love something to incentivize them.
You're right. That's one of the things. See, because mostly I haven't played with a great breadth of players. I've mainly played with my circle of friends. Only a couple of times have I played with people from outside. I think only a handful of times. It's mainly been people that I know personally. So none of them have been people who are over influenced by video games. The problem with video games is that most of them replace or take the place of your imagination. They support it so strongly that you barely have to use it at all. And D&D and role-playing games in general are best when your imagination is ready to take it, to catch it and support the game, and not the other way around. The game shouldn't support your imagination, should be supporting the game. And you need a fit imagination for that. And you can't just have one because you want one. You do have to work at it.
You have to exercise it a little bit.
What troubles me about recent game design and role-playing, and I won't harp on it, so I'm not going to make an issue of it, I don't want to get into an argument, is that a lot of people who have strong influences from video games play the games, they expect the rules, and when they're not there, they put them there, and they become the next generation of game designers, and they put out games like 4th edition, which is the worst edition of D&D. That it's not even D&D really. You know, I never played it. I could not read that rule book. I could not look at it and see a role-playing game. It was not there. And I know a lot of people like that. I'm sure it's a fine game when you play it. I'm sure it's a game, but I could not see D&D in there at all. I couldn't see the room for your imagination to move around. You know, every character had this list of actions. And I don't want to harp on it. Sorry.
Well, I mean, like 4th edition was explicitly designed to be played as a video game. The whole rule set was designed to be used on a virtual tabletop, where all of the rules could be baked into the system, where the computer could actually run bad guys. But then that never happened. So I think that was part of it. I was just thinking about what Dael was saying about making the environment more something that players wanted to use. And something that I was thinking of, I think Patrick Stewart, who wrote Veins of the Earth, brought this up, where you want to create environments that have I forget what he called it, like high kinetic potential or a lot of potential energy. So just stuff like, I don't know, you're in some sort of warehouse and there's like a whole bunch of barrels and they're like in a net and it's just like hanging from the ceiling right above the area where you're fighting. And you don't necessarily have to have rules for that because it's really obvious what's going to happen if someone breaks the net. And it's just sitting there throughout the whole fight. And before long, someone's going to try and cut it down or something. And just having all these systems that are ready to tip in one way or another. And it's really obvious that they are. So that players,
the
players are
minute
just
you
eager to do
mention
something.
a chandelier, you know, someone's going to drop that chandelier on someone or they're going to swing from it, you know, because that's a thing that you've put in there and specifically mentioned and they already have in their head the kind of things that you can use. That's really interesting.
Rules would make that worse. So much worse. Actually, there's a direct example. Like, listen, maybe they could be useful sometimes, but there's like a direct example that we've had already. Ben earlier said it was weird in high-level play where you fall into the lava and then you take so much damage and you crawl out, right? That rule makes lava worse. In the olden days, or in my campaigns at least, if you fell into lava, you would die immediately. because it's lava. Yeah, you know, it makes lava weaker if you try to quantify a survivable rule that will make it so that a character can fall in and survive and have a sleep and recover fully. Doesn't work. It hurts the game. You know, that hurts the game.
You have to figure out, like, at what point are the rules no longer helping? Because like the way that I think about role-playing games is as I think of them by default as not having any codified rules, as being basically just freeform. And then people slowly add in rules basically to make things more convenient so that you can skip over like long discussions about things. So these rules are just there for convenience. So that's the way that I think about them. And so I'm always sort of on the lookout for when a rule is no longer speeding up the game or is no longer making the game more enjoyable, so that you can just pull them out. Because I want to pull out as many as I can. Sometimes you pull out too many and then you just end up with these endless discussions.
Wise policy.
Yeah.
I think where I'm coming from is that, I read a lot of modern indie games and things like that. I love dipping into other genres. But the problem I find with almost every single one that I back on Kickstarter and I receive, and I'm finally reading the rules, and it's so rules light. It doesn't have the scaffolding or the structure necessary to actually help a DM understand how to run the game. You can with D&D, this is another thing that makes D&D so special as a game, is that because it is so baked into cultural understanding, you actually honestly don't need a very deep rule set in order to understand how to make D&D work, because it's handed down almost as an oral cultural thing. Your DM runs for you and then you run for your players. It's sort of this cultural thing. Whereas you get a new game and they're like, and you'll just improv this scene, and it doesn't give you the boundaries that enable creativity. It's kind of like when you you start a game with your players and you just say, what do you do? And they don't have anything to bounce off, they don't have anything to encourage them to make choices because there's too much freedom. And I find that with a lot of new indie games. So when I say that I like having rules to incentivize it, I mean really simple, light touch rules that just give you a framework that you can build your own stuff on, which probably is partly because I'm such a home brewer that I'm like, I want to have stuff that I can then change and alter and break and do whatever I want with, which wouldn't work for every DM by any means. But I do like having something to bounce off, just so that that whether the DM or the players, they know what the game is. They can visualize what is happening around them without having to worry that they're going to get it wrong because there's no pointers. I guess
that makes sense to me, because there is this spectrum here where on one side you have something like a board game where everything is codified. Like there is no free form. There's not very many free form board games. Everything is an interaction with a rule. And then the far end, you would have like pure free form role playing. And it's interesting figuring out where people fall on that spectrum.
I know a game that is a little bit more wishy-washy. It's not a board game. It's pinball. There's rules in pinball. It's based on physics, but advanced pinball players can get very, very freeform with what they do with those tables. Incredible stuff. But in this discussion, like it's really hit home to me how hard it is to explain the line between quality rule and too much or too little. And like earlier, I'm listening to myself talk and I'm thinking, what am I talking about? What point am I really making? And I'm starting to doubt my own assertion. So I can say, though, that when a rule isn't useful, you'll know it. Like you'll sense it. I think you'll sense it. And I definitely sensed it in a game. I don't remember which one it was. It might have been that Dragon Age role-playing game they put out, where they had...
Do not get me started. We'll get in trouble, but go on.
I was furious.
I need to know this.
I think it might not have been that game, but I was furious that it would dare suggest rules for social encounters. I'm doing finger quotes. Run like combat. Oh, well, your social initiative is her, and on your turn you can smile or you can. And I'm like, this is the worst garbage I've ever seen. I couldn't believe. I'm mad about it now. I haven't seen the game.
Actually, the Dragon Age system, which, by the way, I shouldn't be complaining about it. I'm going to get in trouble for this, but I'm just saying, for starters, don't call your system Dragon Age, because I can't Google it, because AGE standing for whatever the hell it stands for, it just becomes me Googling the video game. But they have this inbuilt thing called the stunt system, which is basically anytime you roll doubles, you can do a special thing. But there's this core problem to that system, because it makes things like, I don't know, try and trip the enemy. It makes that something that you can only do when you roll doubles. And it really strips away player freedom. You end up, well, on my turn, I will attack with my sword, because it's literally the only thing I can do unless I happen to roll doubles on the dice. And even then, when you roll doubles on the dice, you also have to succeed in order to do the thing. So it's like, I see what they were going for, and I admire the attempt. I don't love the application.
Yeah,
there's a great example of a rule that I think makes that sort of thing easier, which was in Dungeon Crawl Classics. They do a special thing for each class, traditional D&D classes, that makes them a little bit more interesting. And one of them is the fighter. His special ability is called Feats of Strength, or Mighty Feats of Arms. And basically every time, every time that you attack, you add on a special move that you're doing. Every single time. And then if you roll well, it happens. So if you're a fighter, you are nonstop saying, I trip the enemy, I kick him off the stairs, I hurl this thing into him every time you do something. It's great, because that's what the fighter does. The fighter is just mayhem throughout the whole combat area.
That's a very good rule.
That's cool.
Yeah. It's an excellent rule.
That's
because in
very
AD&D, if you wanted to trip someone over, you'd say to the DM, I trip him over. And the DM would say, okay. it was really that simple. For most of these things, I wouldn't go past ability checks, for a lot of things. That is a really elegant rule, that fighter rule that you just. That's the key. Elegant rules trump clever rules.
There's a lot of fun stuff like
so
that
true.
in Dungeon Crawl
Anytime.
Classics.
Yeah.
I think we're going to end there. We were supposed to go for an hour. We went for like an hour and 50 minutes. So this has been really, really fun.
We were having good discussion.
Yeah, it's been absolutely great.
Good value discussion. High value.
Thank you so much, Bard and Dael, for joining me. It's been fantastic. And as usual, I will put their links down in the description below. Go and click on those buttons and then click on the red subscribe button. You know how it works. And thanks again for joining me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.